It's Monday, May 4th, 2020. Hey, Missouri is open for business again, whatever that means. On Friday, we talked about the idea that there are several things in all of our lives that are important to us, but we'd all agree that some things are more important and more valuable than other things. We probably all have a pair of shoes that we really like, but no matter how much we like them, no pair of shoes is more valuable to us than our vehicle. And a vehicle is not as valuable as our home, and our home, no matter how much we paid for it, is not as valuable as our family. In fact, we set the value of a particular item by the price we would be willing to pay to get that thing fixed if it were broken. $50 might be too much to pay to get a pair of shoes fixed. $500 might be too much to pay to get your car fixed, depending on the car, of course. $5,000 would certainly not be too much to get your house fixed if it was broken and unusable after a storm, for example. And if your child were sick, you would mortgage and sell everything else that you have to see him or her restored to health. We know how valuable something is to us by how much we're willing to pay to get that thing fixed if it's broken. And that thought is staggering when we remember that one day our relationship with God the Father was broken, and He was willing to give the life of His only Son to fix our broken relationship with Him. What is staggering about that is that that means that God thinks that we are worth the life of His only Son. And the fact that He was willing to give His Son in exchange for us means that we are both the most choice and the most expensive things in all the universe. Jesus gave His life in exchange for ours, and He did that without wondering whether we deserved it and without wondering whether we would prove worthy of His sacrifice. He met our needs because He loved us, and He set no conditions on His love, and that ought to make us feel absolutely awesome. But it doesn't always strike us that way, does it? I think we all tend to feel unlovable because most of us have never experienced unconditional love, or at least we haven't experienced it since we were small children years ago. But despite the fact that unconditional love doesn't seem to grow on trees, none of us are able to thrive or even live without being loved unconditionally. Unconditional love is something that we need right here, right now. Fortunately, too many of us have known love only with conditions attached. The people in our lives may or may not ever actually articulate it, but it is clear that they are withholding or will withhold their love if we don't perform, if we don't live up to their expectations. After all, how many people do you know with whom you can really be yourself? And so we're forced to deal with the pressing reality that the short supply of unconditional love means that most of us will never have any, given the impossibly high demand that comes from every corner for unconditional love. Because as we've said, everyone seems to put conditions on their love for us. They will love us if we will, and I don't even want to guess at the way you personally would have to finish that sentence. Everyone sets conditions on their love, or at least almost everyone. I wonder how many of us could name the disciples. It seems to me that I knew a song a long time ago that had all the names of the disciples in an odd sort of rhyme, and it was good that it was an odd rhyme because some of them had odd names. James the Lesser and Simon the Zealot come to mind, though they were not some of the more famous disciples of Jesus. And among the followers of Christ, there was one that the Apostle John called the follower whom Jesus loved, as though that were his name. And it's important that we notice that John called him the follower whom Jesus loved and not the follower who loved Jesus. We can all imagine that one of the followers might have said that Jesus was his favorite among all the people in that group, but can we imagine that Jesus would have had a favorite from among the followers? Was there really one that he loved more than he loved the others? Well, John uses this term, the follower whom Jesus loved, several times in the gospel that he wrote. And remarkably, this follower whom Jesus loved always seems to be in the right place at the right time. He always seems to be the one who is nearest to Jesus. Let me read some verses from John so that you can see what I mean. John 13:23 says, one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. This first reference to the disciple whom Jesus loved took place in the upper room on the last evening that Jesus and his followers were together. And the disciple whom Jesus loved, whoever he is, was sitting right next to Jesus. John 19:26 says, "When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby." This verse is about when Jesus was hanging on the cross. And as he hung on the cross, he scanned the crowd that was at the foot of the cross, and standing right there at the foot of the cross was Jesus' mother Mary and only one of his disciples, this unnamed disciple whom Jesus loved. John 20, verse 2 says, "So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved." Mary Magdalene arrived at the tomb early on the resurrection morning and noticed immediately that the stone was gone and the tomb was open and the body of Jesus was missing. She ran from the tomb back to where the disciples were staying and found Peter and this unnamed disciple whom Jesus loved and told them what had happened. And they too went to the tomb. John 21:7 says, "Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.'" After the resurrection, Jesus went back to heaven and only sporadically appeared to his followers. Here in John 21, the disciples had spent the night fishing, and the next morning, Jesus surprised them by appearing on the shore. All the disciples saw him at a distance, but it was this disciple whom Jesus loved that recognized him. And then it's this next verse that we get the first hint of who John is talking about when he uses the phrase, "the disciple whom Jesus loved." John 21:20, 21, and 24 says, "Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper." So we know it's the same guy. Again, from John 21, "This is that disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." Did you catch it? Remember, John is the one who wrote this book, and he keeps referring to one of the disciples as that disciple whom Jesus loved. To whom was John referring when he spoke of the disciple whom Jesus loved? Clearly, he was referring to himself. John called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Of all the self-centered audacity, where does he get off thinking of himself and speaking of himself like that? Well, the beautiful thing is that John always seems to be in the right place at the right time. He seems to be the one who's closest to Jesus. He seems to be the one who recognizes Jesus when Jesus shows up in an unexpected place. And I have to wonder, how is it that John always seems to be in the right place? Could it be because of how he saw himself? Is it possible that John always seems to be in the right place because he saw himself as that disciple whom Jesus loved? I think it's more than possible. I think that John's life was completely transformed because he saw himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. I say that because it's always nice to be with someone that we love. I certainly love being with people that I love. And probably the only thing nicer than being with someone that we love is to be with someone who loves us. Who wouldn't want to be with someone who loves them? You know, we talk sometimes about doing our devotions. And I even remember back in college referring to them as devos. Not divas, but devos. We would say, "I did my devos this morning." And we would say that because it's not always easy to make time for doing your devos, so we may as well get some credit for it when you succeed. But listening to John talk like this, listening to John call himself that disciple whom Jesus loved, and knowing that John always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, and always seems to be the one who is closest to Jesus, knowing all that makes me think that maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing when we find it difficult to make time to do our devotions. Hey, we're out of time again today. So it's time for you to do the prayer time of your devos. As you pray, remember that we all love to be with people that we love, but we love it even more when we can be with people who love us. Remember that as you step into the throne room, and go there not as a groveling servant who fears the king's wrath, but run into his presence as a well-loved child. Watch him bend down from his great throne as you step into his presence to be with your Abba Father. Let's talk again tomorrow.